As more people cancel cable TV, C-SPAN's funding is at risk. This summer, an anonymous donor has stepped up to help by matching all donations up to $25,000. I'm Caitlin with C-SPAN, and this means your gift will go twice as far. Your donation supports unfiltered access to government and public affairs programming, including the C-SPAN podcasts you value. Visit cspan.org/donate to make your gift today. Every dollar helps us reach our $25,000 goal. Thank you for listening and supporting C-SPAN. Donate today at cspan.org/donate.
On About Books, we delve into the latest news about the publishing industry with interesting insider interviews with publishing industry experts. We'll also give you updates on current nonfiction authors and books, the latest book reviews, and we'll talk about the current nonfiction books featured on C-SPAN's BookTV.
Welcome to About Books. This week we're talking with the 2024 winners of Washington Monthly Magazine's Kukula Prize. Washington Monthly began the award in 2020 to highlight the best in nonfiction book reviews and promote public affairs book criticism.
And now joining us on BookTV is one of the winners of the Kukula Book Review Award, Yangyang Cheng. You're full-time at Yale. What do you do there?
Thank you. So I'm a research scholar at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center. There, my work focuses on studying the history of science in China, the development of science and technology in the country, as well as that in the global system of science and how that impacts U.S.-China relations.
Now, in your review that you won the award for, you reviewed two books, one fiction, one nonfiction. Were these your choice, or was this an assignment?
This was actually my choice. So I pitched the initial book, the nonfiction one by Professor Darren Byler, Terror Capitalism. And I usually take the approach of doing reviews across many months. And during that time, the fiction, the novel, The Backstreets by Perhat Tuson, where Professor Byler was also one of the translators, came out. And I was actually closely tied with the book Terror Capitalism and was raised in it. So the two pairs really well. And that was when I suggested to the editor that I review these two together.
Why did you choose to review books about the Uyghur culture?
This is a great question. So I'm a Han Chinese woman, and I was born and raised in China, and my immediate family still live there. And I came to the U.S. in 2009 for graduate school, and I was originally trained as a particle physicist. And through the course of this, I also watched the political repression and increasing political repression in my birth country, and in particular ethnic oppression in the northwestern region of Xinjiang, with great anguish. And that also prompts me to rethink about my own position as a Han Chinese woman, as a majority in my country of birth, and as a racialized minority in my country of residence. So I do think that this brings a particular perspective to these two books, on one hand, from the ethnic and racial perspective. On the other hand, as I mentioned, I am a historian of science, and one way I describe my work is that I study the dynamics of science at the border, where the border is not just the territorial bounds of nations, but can also be the contours of social constructs such as race and ethnicity. So for example, I myself, as an immigrant in this country, I carry a border on my back. And the Uyghur people in China, who are of the racialized minority, also exist at the border, and that is closely related to my work. And I think I have a social responsibility to be in conversation with these books in a public outlet, and especially towards an American audience.
Did you find that the Backstreets and Terror Capitalism were similar in their viewpoint?
That is an interesting question. So The Backstreets was written by a Uyghur novelist and poet, Perhat Tuson. And he is actually about the same age as my parents. And then, of course, he was describing that book has a lot of autobiographical elements, that he was describing his own experience related through this central character, this nameless protagonist. And the novel was set in the early 1990s. On the other hand, Professor Darren Byler is an American anthropologist, and so he was basing his work on his years of field work in China, especially in the Xinjiang region in the 2010s. And so they are very different in their approach, but they both explore the notions of colonial dispossession and capitalist exploitation in the western Chinese region of Xinjiang. And so I think they are in conversation with each other, but I would not put them in the same category because they're written from very different experiences, positionalities, as well as formats.
Yangyang Cheng, you said that you spend months working on a review. How long was this review, and what's your process?
This is a great question. So I myself, I'm an academic, but I also think book reviews for me as both a reader and a writer is one of my favorite forms. And I think it is a way for me to produce public scholarship, especially when I review academic books like Terror Capitalism in a public-facing outlet. And my approach to them is very academic, so it usually takes me many months, up to a year, to do a book review like this. And I usually like to put multiple books together in conversation. I think a book review, if done well, it is not a book report, right? It really challenges the reviewer intellectually, ethically, and emotionally, how to be in conversation with a book, how to put that in context with the author's previous body of work, put that in context with other existing literature on this subject, and also to be in context with the book itself, to both be able to engage with it on its own terms, and also to take critical distance and to put that into a broader context and to ultimately advance the conversation on this subject.
The author of the fiction book, The Backstreets, is Perhat Tursun. What can you tell us about Perhat Tursun?
Yes. So he's someone whom I think about a lot, as I mentioned, because he's about the same age as my parents. And he was born in the late 1960s in China. And he was among the first generation of Uyghurs in China to receive a bilingual education in a brief liberalization period in the 1980s, where he studied in Beijing. And he was and then he returned to his homeland of Xinjiang, where he worked as a poet and a writer. And he actually, because he received a bilingual education, he wrote poetry both in Uyghur and in Mandarin, which I could read directly. And some of his Uyghur poetry have also been translated into Mandarin. And he disappeared into the mass internment camps several years ago, around 2018. And it was reported that he is now serving a 16-year prison sentence. And he's someone whose work constantly brings me sorrow as well as solace, as I live away from my birth country as well. On the other hand, he's also someone who I think a lot. I think he remains someone that presses on my own conscience and forces me to reflect on what it means to be a Chinese person and what it means to engage in systems of injustice in this world and try to fight against it.
If he's imprisoned, how did this book get published?
This is a great question. So Darren Byler, actually, he got to know Perhat Tursun during his field work there, and then Perhat Tursun entrusted his manuscript with Darren, and then told Professor Byler that pressed Professor Byler to translate them and to publish them to face a wider audience. And actually, Professor Byler, in his foreword, in his translator's notes to the Backstreets, commented that for a while he actually betrayed Perhat Tursun's wishes and held the manuscript back because he did not wish to endanger the author as well as the anonymous translator. But later, when he learned the news of this long prison sentence, and he understood that there is a moral and a social responsibility to bring this book out into the world, and that was when he contacted publishers, and this novel in translation as the first Uyghur novel translated into English was published by Columbia University Press.
And Darren Byler is the author of the other book that Yangyang Cheng reviewed, Terror Capitalism, Uyghur Dispossession and Masculinity in a Chinese City. Is he a colleague of yours, or is Professor Byler somebody you work with?
So he's a colleague of mine in a broader sense. My own approach towards book reviews is that I do not review books of close friends or close colleagues that I directly collaborate with. And he's someone whose work that I've learned from and observed from a distance for a while. And also, I think, as I answered earlier, I have a unique approach and perspective to this story, partly because of my background as a Han Chinese woman born and raised in China, and partly because of my work as a historian of science with regards to China that deals with the dynamics of science at the border.
And from your review of Terror Capitalism, you write, quote, as the earlier chapters of Terror Capitalism masterfully elucidate, racial subjugation and colonization are not exclusive to China, but rather are embedded in a global system the West is complicit in and has benefited from Uyghur dispossession. How do you say that? Why do you say that?
So that is really a central theme of the book Terror Capitalism. As we live in this moment of rising tensions between the United States and China, there is often a tendency in terms of the public and policy discourse here in this country, in the US, where China is being seen as this place of exception, and any form of political repression or ethnic oppression is seen as somehow unique to its quote-unquote nominally communist system. And I think what terror capitalism is really unique in its strength is that it places Uyghur dispossession and the ethnic repression into both a longer, larger history and a global context in terms of the histories of imperialism and colonialism, and also the forces of global capitalism that have both contributed to and benefited from Uyghur dispossession in Xinjiang.
Yangyang Cheng of Yale University is one of the winners of the 2024 Kukula Book Review Prize. Congratulations. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, another winner of this year's Kukula Award for book reviews is Helen Lewis, who is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Helen Lewis, what was the book you reviewed?
It was called Going Infinite by Michael Lewis.
And what's it about?
It's about the rise and fall of Sam Bankman-Fried, who you might remember was convicted for fraud in New York. And it's about the idea of him as a kind of crypto whiz kid, you know, this guy from outside the financial system, bringing a really big challenge to it. And now that is classic Michael Lewis territory. You know, his book, The Big Short, was turned into a very successful film. He's written a lot about mavericks, challenging kind of big finance. The twist here was that the guy who was challenging big finance, you know, it all turned out to be a mirage and an illusion. He was convicted of lending money from one part of his business to another and not being able to cover essentially a kind of run on the bank. And that was why it was a really interesting book for me to review, because Michael Lewis always slightly falls in love with his subjects. And he was, I thought, pretty soft on Sam Bankman-Fried and squashed him into that kind of narrative of the maverick taking on the establishment, when in fact, as it turned out, he was a con man, essentially.
And the headline and subheadline of your review is The Journalist and the Fallen Billionaire in Going Infinite, Michael Lewis Gets Close, Too Close to Sam Bankman-Fried. Why too close?
Well, one of my favourite pieces of literature is The Journalist and the Murderer by Janet Malcolm, which is about the idea that journalists inevitably kind of always betray their subjects. And in a way, the problem here was that Michael Lewis didn't betray his subject. You know, he did just adopt his position. He did end up feeling very sympathetic to somebody. And I think that's one of the things I find really interesting about storytelling. If you spend a lot of time with somebody and you really see things from their point of view, you inevitably end up more sympathetic to them. But what I felt there wasn't space for in Going Infinite was all the people who lost out. You know, I made a documentary about crypto the year before I wrote this review, and I talked to people, you know, who'd put their kids' college fund into crypto, or, you know, something that they'd planned to renovate their garage. Just these sort of, you know, small to medium-sized losses, let alone some people losing their life savings. And so this wasn't a kind of cost-free crime. And taking the part of this, you know, falling in love with this kind of scruffy billionaire who said he wanted to save the world, squeezed out of that story all the victims of Sam Bankman-Fried.
Well, you go on to write in your review that, quote, once you accept the limitations of Lewis's approach, however, you are free to enjoy its pleasures. He remains the greatest living exponent of the plain style in reporting. Each word might be worth $10, but he studiously avoids $10 words. His eye for detail is unsurpassed.
Well, it's one of the nice things about writing reviews for The Atlantic is you have the kind of space to breathe. You know, anybody who wants to write book reviews will tell you that, you know, you're trying to do justice to 300-400 pages, maybe more. And for me, writing this book review was about saying there's lots of things that I love about Michael Lewis. As a writer, he is always compelling to read. But here, I felt, you know, he'd got some things wrong. And being able to hold those two thoughts at the same time is one of the pleasures of long-form book reviewing.
Helen Lewis, did you pick to review Going Infinite, or was it an assignment by The Atlantic?
I think The Atlantic would have assigned it to somebody anyway, because Michael Lewis is such a reliable bestseller, and his eye for who to write about and his access is always exquisite. You know, Sam Bankman-Fried is a big figure in the culture, but I think I elbowed my way into this one, both as a kind of committed previous Michael Lewis writing fan, and also because I think crypto is such an interesting story. It's kind of receded from the headlines now a little bit, but you know, at one time you couldn't move on the internet for people trying to sell you Bitcoin and other forms of cryptocurrency. I don't know if you remember, there was a Super Bowl where it seemed like pretty much every other advert was for one or another crypto company. So it was this thing that was completely in the air, and people had a vague awareness. There were some questions over it, but also a lot of people had seemed to get rich off it. And so I really, really wanted to write about it for that reason.
And what other topics do you write about for The Atlantic? Anything you want to? Do you have that freedom?
I pretty much do. I've got a pretty expansive beat. I call it politics and culture, but I mean that encompasses basically all of human life, I think. So as you can tell, I'm British, so I do write a bit about the British monarchy. I write about British politics, but I'm really interested in emerging cultural phenomenon. I'm interested in fads and enthusiasms and sort of social contagions, because those things that sweep through populations, you know, and an idea suddenly catches fire. I think those things are always really interesting to write about.
Well, Michael Lewis, of course, is very well known, a bestseller, and Going Infinite was reviewed multiple times. Do you read those reviews before writing yours?
I didn't. It took a little time for the review to come out through our fact-checking process, so some other ones had come out. And there is always a kind of tense moment when you think, did I get this completely wrong? Did other people see things that I didn't see? But that's part of the pleasure and the challenge of doing a book review, is it's just you and the book, and you have to put everything else aside, you know, everything, the kind of cliquishness of it, or, you know, what your peers will think, because ultimately your job as a book reviewer is to say people work really hard for their money, and should they spend their money on this book? Is this book important? Is it worth reading? Is it true? Is it right? And when you put all those kind of things aside, you write, I think, a much better review. So I would always try not to let other people's opinions influence mine, because ultimately I'm being paid to give my opinion, and my opinion based on a very close encounter with the work that I'm reviewing.
Well, Helen Lewis, you certainly share a surname with Michael Lewis. Do you know him at all?
I don't. I've seen him speak a couple of times. I also share a surname with Will Lewis, another British journalist who's got into some trouble lately in America. Also no relation. It's been a tough year for the journalistic Lewises, I would have to say.
You are also an author. How many books have you written?
I've written one. And I think that does help you in book reviewing, in that it doesn't exactly make you kinder, but I think it makes you realise quite how much work goes into a book and how much love goes into a good book. And while that doesn't make me go easier on anybody, I think it makes me try and understand the books in terms of what they're trying to do. Because the easiest and laziest type of book review is, why didn't you mention X? Where, you know, X is your pet enthusiasm. And instead what you have to do is look at the task that the author has set for herself or himself and say, did they achieve that? So yeah, I've written one book, Difficult Women, which is a history of British feminism, and I'm currently working on another book which is about genius. And that's one of the other reasons I wanted to review this book, is that there is a standard genius template. And Sam Bankman-Fried looked like he fitted it. You know, this idea of he was scruffy, he didn't really care about his personal appearance, he didn't have particularly many social skills. And that's a very modern template of what we think a genius looks like, the kind of tech disruptor genius. And so it overlapped with some of the things that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years.
Did your book, Difficult Women, get reviewed, and what was your take on the reviews?
I think they were very interesting. They were largely positive. So, you know, look, come back to me when I've had some tough, brutal reviews, and maybe I can complain about them. But no, I found being reviewed really interesting, just because it's a process of finding out what other people think is new about your book. You've spent so much time working on this thing that you kind of can't see the wood for the trees. And so it was really interesting to find out that some of the things that I'd mentioned in passing, you know, really stuck out to other people. One of the things I think is really tough is space constraints. And, you know, I think a type of review that I'm sure that I've done and that I found happened to my book, and I know other authors have complained about this, is a kind of the book review that ends up being a summary of what's in the book, and then not really very much critical engagement with it. You know, it's essentially a kind of digest with not a lot of opinion put into it. And that's why, you know, I love writing for The Atlantic, because you get the space, really, not just to say, this is what this book says, but here's what I think about it. Here's where it's right. Here's where it's wrong. And that luxury is what I think makes doing reviews for The Atlantic such a joy.
Is there a book review that you read weekly?
I read so many book reviews. I think the really tragic thing is I think I probably do use the digest service, right? I probably read more book reviews than I will ever get time to read books. And that's why I think literary culture is so important in America, because it's about where do new ideas come from? Where do these really big debates get had? And, not everybody can read every new book that comes out, even in their own specialist area. So there is a point about literary culture pointing people to good things. But I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, I read the Atlantic. In Britain, we have the Guardian and the Times and Private Eye and various other places. And I think probably it's fair to say that British book reviews can often be meaner. We used to have an award in Britain that was called Hatchet Job of the Year for the nastiest book review, which I think would be quite offensive to some American sensibilities.
Helen Lewis, have you read Michael Lewis's body of work, The Big Short, Moneyball? What's your take on those books? I've
read a fair few of them. I haven't read all of them because he's been writing for quite a long time now. And I think he has got a brilliant style. He picks his stories incredibly well, and he picks his protagonists incredibly well. And I think The Big Short is a very classic example of that. It is a very smart way to look at the financial crisis through all the people who saw it coming, the Cassandras who saw it coming. And I think I would probably say that's my second favourite of all his books. My favourite of all his books is The Undoing Project, which is about Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky and the work they did in behavioural economics. And that is a beautiful portrait of two people who revolutionised an academic field, essentially going to economics and saying, you're assuming that everybody is a rational actor, but actually people are irrational. People act in ways that they really shouldn't do in terms of their best interests because of all these other things. And it's a beautiful portrait not only of a kind of intellectual project, but also the personal friendship and these two incredible life stories of the two protagonists. And I think, I wanted to bring this out, the fact that Michael Lewis is a good writer and he picks his subjects really well. And it was more interesting to me to see what I consider to be a kind of a rare miss by him than it is to read somebody who I don't think is very good or I think is partisan. And exploring that complexity was what really appealed to me.
Helen Lewis is the author of Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights. Your newest book is coming out when?
It's coming out next year. It's called The Genius Myth.
Helen Lewis, winner of this year's Kukula Award for book review. Thanks for spending a few minutes with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for About Books. BookTV will continue to bring you publishing news and author programs. You can get this podcast on the C-SPAN Now app, and you can, of course, watch online anytime at BookTV.org.